This morning. I'm sure when you've been on a long journey, probably most of us have taken to playing games in the car. I'm sure it's kind of a universal thing, isn't it? You're on a long journey, there's some children in the car. Are we nearly there yet, Dad? No, let's play a game. And the go-to game is probably I Spy, isn't it? That's the go-to game. We were playing that just this week. We got a little bit bored of I Spy, and in the Parkinson family we've made up a new game. It's called I Describe with My Little Mind. It expands your horizons beyond just what you can see to what you can think about. But there's another game that you play in the car, and it's word association game. I'm sure most of you have played that. You say a word, and then someone has to say another word that kind of goes with that word, and you keep going, and you're not allowed to repeat, and you're not allowed to kind of hesitate and have big long pauses. And when you play that game, you realise there's things that belong together. You know, oranges and lemons, Laurel and Hardy, fish and chips. These are just pairs, and you can't really think of one without the other. When you play in the word association game, every now and again, someone will say something, and you think, they don't belong together. You can't put those two together. They're not associated. And if you were playing the word association game with James, the writer of this letter, and if you said trials, James would say joy. And you would say, no, James, they don't belong together. Trials doesn't belong with joy. And James would say, no, yes, it does. Let me explain why. And we're going to be thinking this morning more about why trials and joy belong together. It's a startling start to this letter, isn't it? Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. It's just astonishing, isn't it? How can James say that? How can James say, count it, not just a little bit of joy, but all joy, or if you've got an NIV, pure joy, when you face trials of various kinds? We're going to be going through this letter through the months of May and June, and a little recap of what we covered last Sunday night. We did a kind of overview of the letter, the framework in which the letter fits, and if you've not listened in on that, you can probably get it online. But James, he's the writer of this letter. He's the brother of Jesus, and he's writing this letter to Christians who are scattered, and he's writing to help them persevere. They've come to trust in Jesus, and he wants them to keep following Jesus. Trusting in Jesus means that there's a way that you should walk, and there's a way that you shouldn't walk. And he wants them to persevere. He doesn't want them, as they're scattered among the nations, to just assimilate and compromise and become like everyone else. He wants them to persevere, and he's reminding them through this letter of challenges that they're going to face, things that are going to try and throw them off track and stop them getting home. Stop them getting to their heavenly home. And one of those things that they're going to find difficult is these trials. As we go through this letter of James, we're going to see that he jumps around a little bit. So you saw that in our passage today. 1 minute we're thinking about trials, and then we're thinking about wisdom, and then we're thinking about money, and then we're thinking about temptation. And that's led some people to say James is like a book of Proverbs, just snippets and sound bites. But I think actually, as we'll see this morning, there's a little bit more structure to that. It's not quite as structured as one of the letters of, say, Paul, but I think there's a definite structure here. It's not just random collections of wisdom. And if this morning, if we're going to understand why joy and trials are linked, there's two points that James wants us to get a clear hold on. The first one is that we must receive God's wisdom. If we're going to link joy and trials together, there's a wisdom that doesn't come from ourselves, but it comes from God. And the second point is that we've got to remember God's goodness, and there's a little outline there of where we're going to go. So the first point, receiving God's wisdom. Persevering in trials, receiving God's wisdom. What are these trials that James is writing about? He doesn't give us too many details, does he? In verse 2, he just says trials of various kinds. I said to the children, these are things that we would rather have, that are in our lives, that we'd rather not be there. Just difficult circumstances. They're the kind of things that give us anxious thoughts, the things that keep us awake at night, those circumstances that just kind of ride roughshod over all of our plans and spoil our weeks and our months. These are the kind of things that James is writing about. I'm sure you can identify, as we sit here, some things in your life that are difficult, that you'd rather not be there. James says they're trials of various kinds, and they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And James says, count it all joy. Count it all joy. That's a challenge, isn't it? That's a challenge when we think about those things in our lives. And James says, count it all joy. He doesn't want us to count it joy because of the trial and what it is in itself. Some things are desperately hard and desperately sad. He wants us to count it all joy because of what God is going to do with that trial in our lives as his children. So he says, verse 3 and 4, count it all joy, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. When it comes to trials, God's purpose is that he would test our faith. That's not testing like an exam, like he wants to fail us or see if we're up to the grade. It's testing as in, the word comes from the refiners and the metalwork industry. When people would test a metal and refine a metal, they would heat it, and the impurities would come to the top. They would be skimmed off, and it would be proved and refined and made pure. That's what God is going to do through our trials with our faith. He's going to test it and prove it to be the real deal. That goes counter really to what we sometimes think. Sometimes we think like this: we learn to trust God when everything is going well, when he answers our prayers the way we expect him to, when our circumstances are all as they should be. That's when we learn to trust God. But James is saying, actually, no, our faith grows when we're going through difficulties. It's very easy to imagine that we have great faith when the sun is always shining and when the grass is always green and everything's going according to plan. It's very easy to think you're really trusting Jesus when business is booming, when the fridge is full and you're feeling very well. But in those sort of circumstances, if we're not careful, what can happen is that faith can shrivel up. We can think it's there, but it's shriveling up like an unused muscle. Because it's trials that produce steadfastness of faith. It's through these trials that we're made to persevere, and it's through these trials, James says, that we become mature. Listen to how one writer puts it. We say that we believe that God is our Father, but as long as we remain untested on the point, our belief falls short of steady conviction. But suppose the day comes, as it does and will, when circumstances mock our creed, when the cruelty of life denies his fatherly care, when the sheer haphazard and meaningless jumble of events challenges the possibility of the Creator's ordering hand. It is in this way that life's trials test the genuineness of our faith. That's why James says, count it all joy when you face trials of many kinds. Because you know what? That steadfastness of faith is to be more desired than anything else. It's to be more desired than all the comforts and pleasures of this world. Real, true steadfastness of faith. I wonder this morning, is that how you view the trials in your life? Is that how you're prone to view the difficulties that come your way? I suspect not. It's not usually my first reaction when things aren't going right. is to count it all joy. That's not my first reaction. And that's why we need wisdom. That's why we need wisdom from above. And that's why James goes on to talk about wisdom in verse 5. He says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. The wisdom in this context is to do with how we view these trials. And the wisdom isn't a kind of a clever way of getting out of the trials. The wisdom is to see God's purposes in the trials. It's to almost see things from God's perspective. We may agree in theory that yes, trials strengthen our faith and that's a good thing and we should have joy, but in practice it's just really hard. It's really hard, so we need this wisdom, and James assumes we will need help. So he says ask, because God isn't holding anything back. When it comes to giving his children wisdom, God isn't holding anything back. He's generous. He wants us to ask. Ask for wisdom. Ask for wisdom before the trial. Father, if everything's going okay, then ask for wisdom before the trial comes. In the trial, when things are difficult, pause, ask for wisdom. Father, help me to see that through this you are strengthening my faith. James gives a condition of to how we ask. Look at verse 6. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. When we ask for this godly wisdom, James wants us to ask in faith, convinced of something. He wants us to be convinced of God's generosity. But this asking in faith, it's not kind of trying to drum up some feeling within ourselves, trying to get our faith up to the 100% level, and only then will God answer. This asking in faith, well, James helps us with this word double-minded, and we thought about that last Sunday night in verse 8. He describes the person who doesn't ask in faith as double-minded. Double-minded comes up all the way through the book of James, and it's a person who's split. He's kind of wanting to go God's way and persevere, but he's also wanting to go a different way. So James is saying, when we ask in faith. Let's make sure we are wanting to persevere. We're wanting to be steadfast in faith. We're wanting to really see things from God's perspective and not just get out of the trial. We're wanting God to make us strong and sure Christians. The opposite of that is someone who is kind of trying to live in both worlds. Yeah, the steadfastness will be okay, but really I just want things to be made right. I just want things to be normal. And of course, in the trial, that's what we all want. We all want the trial to go away, but God may have bigger purposes for us. And he calls us to recognize those purposes. So that's the wisdom we've got to ask for. And then James gives us an illustration of God's wisdom in verses 9 to 11. He goes on to talk about riches, and it seems a bit random at first, but in this little illustration, he's describing what it looks like to see things from God's perspective, what it looks like to put these wisdom glasses on. So he paints a picture in verses 9 to 11 of two people. The first one is rich, and the second one is poor. Imagine the poor man, he's a Christian, he's struggling to find enough money to pay the electric bill each month. Making ends meet is just really difficult. Maybe he has to walk home because sometimes he can't afford the bus. That's the poor man. And the other guy, he's rich. He's got a second house in the south of France. He goes on holiday there 4 times a year. He's got a big kind of financial cushion in his bank account. They're the two people that James describes for us. Now, without the glasses of God's wisdom on, it looks like the poor man has failed, doesn't it? It looks like the poor man really has no reason to rejoice. His life is hard, and the temptation for the poor man is to think, if only I had more money, then I could be happy. If only things were easier, then I'd have reason for joy. But as soon as you put God's wisdom glasses on, the picture changes. Look at the poor Christian now. The reality is, even though he's poor, he's in a high position. So James says, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. He's in a high position because he's received something from God. He's received salvation, God's grace. He will inherit the world. When he's seeing things from God's perspective, he's rich and he has every reason to exalt. And when we turn to the rich person with the wisdom glasses on, we see that his riches are actually worthless because his wealth can do him no good in the face of death. James describes him as like this flower who's kind of fading in the summer winds, or like blossom that's blown away. We had, where we used to live back in Preston, we had a blossom tree, a cherry blossom tree in the front garden. And every spring it would come out, beautiful kind of pink blossom, but it would only last about a week. And the blossom that looked so nice on the tree was kind of decaying in the side of the curb and becoming kind of a brown sludge. And James says when we have the wisdom glasses on, that's what riches look like. They can do us no good in the face of death. And so he calls to this rich person to boast in his humiliation, that life is fragile, that success is not about money and comfort, but it's about perseverance in the faith. So this morning, let's take time, and we will at the end, and maybe in the week ahead, let's take time to ask God for this wisdom, that we'd see our lives from his perspective, that our trials are producing in us perseverance. And then in verse 12 he says, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. That's why steadfastness is such a big deal, because there's a crown of life that awaits. So that's the first half of the passage. Life is not about avoiding trials, it's about persevering until we reach this crown. The second point when it comes to linking joy and trials is this: we must remember God's goodness. And this is about persevering even in temptation. So if you look down at verse 13, we switch again themes to thinking about temptation. And the root word of trials and temptation is the same. But this word temptation has a different flavour. These trials that we've been looking at so far are all outward. They're to do with circumstances and things that are outside of us. Temptation is a little bit different. That's something that comes from within inside of us. And at every trial, they were kind of stood at a crossroads. These trials are, on the one hand, they're opportunities to persevere and go forward. On the other hand, they are also temptations to turn back. So every time we face some difficulties, though we're at a crossroads, we'll either persevere in the faith and keep following Jesus, or that trial will come with a temptation to make us turn back and take an easier path. So when someone loses their temper and has an angry outburst, I'm sure none of us has ever done that, have we? Lose our temper and have an angry outburst. When someone does that, the temptation is to say something like this: I'm just tired, I'm under so much pressure. That's why I had the angry outburst. If we rephrase that, what we're really saying is the pressure and the tiredness made me lose my temper. And when we realise that our lives are ordered by God, that the trials that come our way in God's providence, what we're really saying is God did it. If God hadn't put me in this circumstance, I wouldn't have lost my temper. God, if you hadn't made my life so difficult, I wouldn't have done the wrong thing. But James points at the finger where it should be pointed. He reminds us that when it comes to temptation and responding wrongly to our trials, God isn't responsible. God is always good. So he says in verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. Rather, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. That's where temptation begins. It begins with our desire. The general idea about humanity, I think, it goes something like this. We're pretty good to start off with. People in general are quite good. Some people face difficult circumstances and that turns them bad. But generally, people are pretty good. And if we can just sort out those bad people's circumstances, they will get better. James says, no, that's wrong thinking. All of us, there is something within each one of us that is a problem, and he calls that desire. That when the pressure is on, we gravitate towards that which is not right. And this desire, he describes a kind of chain or a family as a series of conceptions, like 3 generations of a family. So if you look at verse 16, not 16, verse 14. But each person is tempted when he's lured away and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. So that's the 2nd generation. A desire conceives and leads to sin. And then sin grows up, he gets older, becomes a man. And then when sin conceives, gives birth to death. That's the family. Desire, sin, death. And it's not really a family that we want to be part of, is it? But it's a family that we are all part of by nature. That's who we are. These desires, they lead us astray, they lead us to sin, and then that leads to death. It's been there since Genesis chapter 3, hasn't it? Adam and Eve in the garden, taking the fruit, desire, sin, death. And that's what all of us are like. And when that happens, we generally shake our fists at God and say, it's your fault. You did it. There's many people who used to love God, and yet something has come into their lives, some difficult trial, and it's made them turn away. They have looked at their trial and said, if this is my lot, God is not good. That kind of attitude comes very naturally to us, but James says that kind of attitude is a deception. It's a deception. Look at verse 16. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. If we're tempted when we're tempted to point the finger at God and say, this is your fault, this is your doing, we're deceived. And James gives us a great antidote for that deception. He focuses our minds as we deal with trials and temptations on God's goodness. He says, don't think bad thoughts about God, because God is all good. Everything good, he says, comes from God. Verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. You can hear the echoes of Genesis 1 in there, isn't there? That the Father of lights, he created the lights and put them in the sky. That was the creation there at the beginning. And we know that world was good. God made a good world. And James says everything good and perfect comes from God. God doesn't do bad. God only gives good gifts. And he never changes. Just as he was at the beginning, so he is today. So as we face trials, and as we face temptations to turn away from God, we must remind ourselves that God is good. He's generous. He's not hold anything good back from us. What's the chief evidence of this good and generous God? Well, look at verse 18. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of all that he created. See, the one who has been born again knows that God is good. God has chosen to give us life. He's generous. He's kind. It's a gift. It's a gift. It's not something that we earn, this life. It's a gift. God says, receive from me. Receive my grace. You see, the Lord is making all things new. He's making all things new. And James says he started with his children. We are the first fruits. God is going to once again make all things good and all things right. And as he does that, we're to continue to trust him. He's brought us out of this family of desire and sin and death, and he's brought us into his family of life. So as we walk through this world as his children, let's not be naive. We're going to face trials. Jesus said that's inevitable. They will come our way. They'll come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and in many ways the Christian life is an uphill road all the way to the top. But as we face these trials, let's ask for God's wisdom. Let's remember that through these trials, he's making our faith strong. He's making us steadfast so that we get to that crown of life. And let's not give way to the temptation to think if this is happening, God cannot possibly be good. Because God is only and always good. He never changes. And he's making all things new. So let's together as a church, let's help one another to keep persevering, to keep going in the face of our trials. I'm going to read, as we close, a poem by a chap called John Newton. This poem fits really well with the theme of what we've been looking at today. It's a beautiful poem. Let me read. John Newton, he's asking for faith. He wants his faith to grow. He wants to be a super Christian. So he says, I ask the Lord that I might grow in faith and love and every grace, might more of his salvation know and seek more earnestly his face. 'Twas he who taught me thus to pray, and he, I trust, has answered prayer. But it has been in such a way as almost drove me to despair. I hoped that in some favoured hour at once he'd answer my request, and by his love's constraining power subdue my sins and give me rest. Instead of this, he made me feel the hidden evils of my heart, and let the angry powers of hell assault my soul in every part. Yes, more with his own hand he seemed intent to aggravate my woe. He crossed all the fair designs I'd schemed, blasted my gourds and laid me low. Lord, why is this? I trembling cried. Will you pursue this worm to death? 'Tis in this way, the Lord replied. I answered prayer for grace and faith. These inward trials I employ, from self and pride to set you free, and break your schemes of earthly joy, that you may find your all in me. Shall we pray, and then we'll sing our final hymn? Let's pray.